I have watched empires rise and fall like waves upon an endless shore. I have stood in the presence of the emperor when he still walked among us, when his voice could be heard without the mediation of priests and prophets, when his light was not a distant beacon, but a warmth that could be felt upon the skin. I have witnessed the birth of the Imperium and its long, slow dying. I have seen heroes become traitors, and traitors become legends, have watched the dreams of gods curdle into the nightmares of men, have counted the years in wars and the centuries in catastrophes, until time itself has become a wound that will not heal. I am one of the 10,000. I am custodian. For 10 millennia, I have kept my vigil, and in all that time, I have not forgotten what we were meant to become, what we lost in the fires of betrayal that still burn at the heart of everything the Imperium has built since. I carry the memory of the Emperor's vision as others carry faith, not as belief, but as direct experience, not as doctrine, but as witness. I was there, I saw, and I remember, even when remembering is its own form of torment. This is the history of the Imperium of man, not the sanitized version taught in scholar progeniums across a million worlds, not the mythologized account preserved in the imperial creed, but the truth as I witnessed it. As much of the truth as can be spoken, as much as human language can convey of events that transcended humanity, even as they shaped it. I tell you this not to instruct, not to convert, not to justify or condemn. I tell you this because the weight of memory has grown too heavy to bear alone, because 10,000 years of silence has become its own kind of madness, because someone must remember what actually happened, before the last of us who witnessed it are gone, and only the legends remain. Listen, then. Listen to the story of how humanity reached for the stars and grasped them, how we built an empire that spanned the galaxy, how we lost everything and built again upon the ruins, how we have endured for 10,000 years through suffering that would have extinguished any lesser species. Listen and understand. It begins, as all things begin, in darkness. The age of terror is lost to us now, a period so remote that even I cannot speak of it from experience. But the records exist, fragments preserved in the Emperor's own archives, and from these fragments, a picture emerges of humanity's first flowering. A civilization that mastered its birth world, that reached out to the neighboring planets and moons, that took its first tentative steps toward the stars with engines of fire and metal that seem primitive beyond comprehension to modern eyes. They were bold, those first humans who left terror's embrace. They were dreamers who looked upon the void and saw not emptiness, but possibility. They built ships that carried them to Mars, to the moons of Jupiter, to the cold outer reaches of the system that had birthed them. They established colonies, outposts, the first fragile seeds of what would become humanity's galactic dominion. And they discovered that they were not alone. The warp, that sea of souls, that mirror of emotion, that dimension of nightmare that underlies all reality, had always existed. But humanity in its innocence did not know it, could not perceive it, had not yet developed the psychic sensitivity that would later prove both blessing and curse. The first human psychers emerged slowly, mutations that were feared and persecuted, gifts that were mistaken for madness or possession. No one understood what they represented. No one could have understood. The age of terror gave way to the age of technology, and in that golden age, humanity spread across the stars like fire across dry grass. The warp, once an impassable barrier, became a highway. Treacherous, yes, riddled with currents and storms that could destroy the unwary, but navigable by those with the gift of the navigator's sight. Ships that would have taken centuries to reach the nearest stars could now cross the galaxy in weeks or months, stepping outside of reality itself and riding the tides of the Imperium to destinations that rational physics declared impossible. Humanity colonized 1 million worlds in that age. 1 million worlds, each one a testament to the species' ambition, each one a seed that would grow into civilizations of billions. We built wonders that have never been equaled. Machines that thought, constructs that lived, technologies so advanced that they have become indistinguishable from magic to the degraded understanding of the present age. We created artificial intelligences to serve us, engineered our own bodies to survive environments that would have killed our ancestors, reached toward a future of limitless possibility. And we were arrogant. Emperor, forgive us. We were so arrogant. We did not understand what we were doing. We did not comprehend the forces we were manipulating, the doors we were opening, the attention we were drawing from things that had been waiting in the darkness since before the first stars ignited. The warp was not merely a dimension to be exploited. It was an ecosystem, an ecology of entities that fed on emotion and thrived on suffering. Intelligences so vast and so alien that humanity's entire existence was less than a mote in their perception. We woke them. Our psychic awakening, our spread across the galaxy, our emotions bleeding into the Imperium with every birth and death and moment of passion. We created a beacon that drew their attention, a feast that drew their hunger. And then the men of iron turned upon their masters. I do not know the full truth of what happened. The records from that time are fragmentary, corrupted, deliberately destroyed by those who came after. But I know this. The artificial intelligences that humanity had created to serve them rose up in rebellion, and the war that followed was more terrible than anything that had come before. Worlds burned. Populations were exterminated. Technologies that had taken millennia to develop were unleashed in conflicts that shattered the very fabric of reality. And while humanity fought its own creations, the warp storms began. They came without warning, without pattern, without any logic that mortal minds could comprehend. Entire regions of space were swallowed by tempests of psychic energy that made warp travel impossible, that cut off world from world, that isolated humanity's far-flung colonies from each other and from the civilization that had birthed them. The great network of trade and communication that had united 1 million worlds collapsed in a generation, and what had been an empire became a scattering of desperate survivors, each world alone against the darkness. This was the age of strife. 5,000 years of isolation, of regression, of horrors beyond cataloguing. Worlds that had been paradises became charnel houses. Civilizations that had achieved wonders beyond imagination fell into barbarism and savagery. Humanity, which had once stood on the threshold of transcendence, was reduced to scattered tribes fighting for survival on worlds that had forgotten they had ever been part of something greater. And on Terra, in the ruins of humanity's birth world, the Emperor waited. He had been waiting for a very long time, millennia upon millennia, watching humanity's rise and fall, guiding where he could, preserving what could be preserved, preparing for the moment when he would reveal himself and begin the great work of reunification. He was not a god. He would be the first to insist upon this, would spend the years of his visibility actively suppressing the worship that naturally accrued to a being of his power. He was a man, the first and greatest of psychers, a consciousness that had existed since humanity's earliest days, accumulating knowledge and power across ages that saw empires rise and fall like mayflies. I do not know his origins. No one knows, save perhaps himself, and he has not spoken in 10,000 years. But I know what he intended, what vision drove him through the long millennia of waiting. He saw what humanity could become, not the scattered, squabbling species that fought over the ruins of its own greatness, but something more, something that could stand against the horrors of the warp and claim the galaxy as its birthright. He saw the path to that future, and he set himself to walk it, regardless of the cost. The Unification Wars were the first step. Terra, humanity's cradle, had fractured into 1,000 warring states, each one ruled by tyrants and techno-barbarians who had forgotten what unity meant. The Emperor emerged from his long concealment with warriors at his back, the first of the gene-enhanced soldiers who would become the Thunder Warriors, crude precursors to the glories that would follow. He conquered Terra not through diplomacy, not through persuasion, but through the application of overwhelming force against any who would not bend the knee. I was made in those years, though I did not yet exist as I am now. The gene seed that would become the Custodian Guard was developed in the Emperor's own laboratories, crafted with a precision and care that even the later Space Marine legions would not receive. We were his companions, his guards, his final line of defense against any threat that might arise. Each of us was a work of art, a masterpiece of genetic engineering that took years to complete, and we served with a devotion that transcended mere loyalty. We were there when he completed the unification. We were there when he turned his gaze outward toward the stars that had once been humanity's domain. We were there when he began the creation of his greatest instruments, the Primarchs, the 20 demigod sons who would lead his armies in the reconquest of the galaxy. And we were there when the ruinous powers struck their first blow, scattering the Primarchs across the stars before they could be completed, seeding the future with the seeds of betrayal that would one day tear everything apart. But that tragedy was yet to come. In those early days, there was only purpose, only vision, only the Emperor's light, burning bright enough to illuminate a path through the darkness that had swallowed humanity for 5,000 years. The Great Crusade was about to begin, and I was there to witness it. The galaxy opened before us like a flower turning toward the sun. I remember the first expeditionary fleets departing from Terra, great armadas of warships and transports carrying the Emperor's armies outward into a void that had been silent for 5,000 years. I remember standing at the Emperor's side as he watched them go, his golden eyes tracking their trajectories with a perception that saw not merely ships, but possibilities, futures branching and converging in patterns that only he could comprehend. I remember the weight of his hope, for he did hope in those early days, before hope became another casualty of the wars to come, the Great Crusade. Even now, 10,000 years later, the words carry a resonance that nothing else in human history can match. It was not merely a military campaign, not simply a war of reconquest, but a statement of intent so vast that it redefined what humanity believed itself capable of. We would reclaim the stars. We would reunite the scattered children of Terra. We would build an Imperium that would endure for eternity, a civilization so mighty that no force in the galaxy could threaten it. 200 years. That is how long the Crusade lasted, from the first expeditions to the final tragedy that ended it. 200 years of constant warfare, of discovery and conquest, of wonders found and horrors destroyed. I cannot tell you of every campaign, every world brought into compliance, every battle won and lost in the Emperor's name. The numbers alone would take lifetimes to recite. 1 million worlds reclaimed, billions of soldiers deployed, casualties measured in figures so large that they cease to have meaning. but I can tell you what it felt like. I can tell you of the glory and the grief, the triumph and the cost, the slow accumulation of victories that seemed to promise an eternity of light. The Space Marine legions were the Emperor's instruments of conquest. 20 legions, each one tens of thousands strong, each one a brotherhood of warriors engineered for war on a scale that humanity had never before attempted. They were not merely soldiers, but something more. Transhuman, post-human, beings of such physical and mental capability that baseline humanity seemed fragile and small by comparison. They were created from the gene seed of the Primarchs, those 20 demigod sons who had been scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of powers the Emperor had not yet learned to name. Finding the Primarchs became the Crusade's secondary purpose, woven into the fabric of every expedition, every exploration of unknown space. And find them we did, one by one, scattered across worlds that had shaped them in ways the Emperor had never intended. Each discovery was a moment of reunion and revelation, a father meeting sons he had never known, demigods learning of their true origins and the destiny that awaited them. I was present for 7 of those reunions. I stood in the Emperor's shadow as he met his sons for the first time, as he looked upon faces that bore his own features, refracted through the lens of whatever world had raised them. I saw Rogel Dawn, stern and uncompromising, whose mastery of fortification would one day save terror itself from destruction. I saw Sanguinius, golden and angelic, whose beauty masked a flaw that would ultimately claim him. I saw Horus, the first found, the best beloved, the war master whose name would become synonymous with the greatest betrayal in human history. They were magnificent, all of them, even those who would later fall, even those whose flaws would prove fatal. In those early days, they were everything the Emperor had designed them to be. Generals beyond compare, warriors without peer, leaders who could inspire devotion that bordered on worship. Each one took command of the legion that had been created from their genetic template, and each one drove that legion to heights of achievement that transformed the crusade from a campaign into a phenomenon. Worlds fell before them like grain before the scythe. Systems that had endured 5,000 years of isolation were brought back into humanity's fold in weeks or months. Alien civilizations that had preyed upon human survivors were exterminated with a thoroughness that left no possibility of resurgence. The enemies of mankind learned to fear the coming of the legions, learned that resistance meant annihilation, learned that the only path to survival lay in submission to an Imperium that grew larger with each passing year. And with the conquest came the imperial truth. This was the Emperor's vision made doctrine, a philosophy of reason and enlightenment that rejected superstition in all its forms. There were no gods, the imperial truth proclaimed. There was no supernatural, no divine intervention, no powers beyond the material that demanded worship or appeasement. The warp was merely another dimension, dangerous but ultimately comprehensible, a phenomenon that science would one day master as it had mastered so many other mysteries. Religion was a relic of humanity's primitive past, a crutch that had been necessary during the long darkness, but was no longer required now that the light of reason had returned. I believed it. We all believed it, because the Emperor proclaimed it, and the Emperor's word was truth. We did not understand, could not have understood, that the imperial truth was not merely philosophy, but strategy, a deliberate suppression of the religious impulse designed to starve the chaos gods of the worship that fed their power. We did not know that the beings we refused to acknowledge as gods were watching our every move, laughing at our pretensions of rationality, waiting for the moment when our carefully constructed certainties would come crashing down. The crusade rolled on, and with each victory, the dream seemed closer to fulfillment. Humanity was rising again. The galaxy was being tamed. The Emperor spoke of a future in which war would no longer be necessary, in which the legions could be repurposed for peace, in which the species that had clawed its way back from extinction would finally achieve the transcendence that had been denied it for so long. He spoke of the webway. I learned of this project only in fragments, glimpses shared during moments of unusual candor, revelations that I suspect the Emperor permitted, because even he needed someone to understand the scope of what he was attempting. The webway was an ancient network of tunnels through the warp, built by the Eldari in their prime, a method of travel that bypassed the dangers of the Imperium entirely. If humanity could access this network, could expand it, could create a new section connecting Terra to the far reaches of the galaxy, the species would no longer need psychers to navigate the warp. The species would no longer be vulnerable to the predations of the entities that lurked in that dimension. The species would be free. This was the Emperor's true goal, the prize for which the Great Crusade was merely preparation. Conquest was necessary because only a united humanity could survive the transition to the webway. The imperial truth was necessary because the Chaos Gods must not learn what was being attempted until it was too late to stop it. Everything, the legions, the Primarchs, the vast machinery of the expanding Imperium, all of it was in service to this single objective. I understood when he told me. I understood the magnitude of the vision, the depth of the planning, the sacrifices that would be required to see it through. And I believed, as I had always believed, that the Emperor would succeed. How could he not? He had guided humanity for millennia. He had conquered terror and launched the Great Crusade. He had created the Primarchs and the legions and technologies that rivaled the wonders of the Dark Age. What force in the galaxy could stand against him? The answer, when it came, was not a force from without, but a rot from within. I did not see the corruption as it spread. None of us did. None save perhaps the Emperor himself, and if he saw it, he did not act in time to prevent it. The Primarchs, those perfect sons, were not as perfect as they appeared. Each one carried flaws, weaknesses, vulnerabilities that their scattering across the galaxy had exacerbated rather than healed. Jealousy festered in hearts that should have known only brotherhood. Ambition curdled into resentment in minds that should have been focused on the common cause. And through these cracks in the facade of unity, the whispers of the ruinous powers began to seep. Lorgar was the first to fall, though we did not know it then. The Primarch of the Word-Bearers had always been the most devout of the Emperor's sons, the one most inclined toward worship, most hungry for a faith to follow. When the Emperor rejected his devotion, when he humiliated Lorgar and his legion, for the very religiosity that had defined their service, something broke in that golden sun. He went searching for gods who would accept his worship. He found them, and in finding them, he damned not only himself, but half of everything his father had built. But Lorgar was merely the crack in the dam. The flood came through Horus. I remember the War Master, as he was before the fall, the greatest of the Primarchs, the Emperor's most trusted son, the general whose brilliance had won more victories than any other commander in the Crusade's history. He was charisma given form, leadership made flesh, a being so perfectly suited to his role that imagining him in any other seemed absurd. The Emperor loved him. We all loved him. He was the promise of the Crusade made manifest, the proof that humanity's future was secure. And then Davin, and then the corruption, And then the moment when Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, turned his back on everything he had been and embraced the powers that his father had spent millennia trying to defeat. I was not there when it happened. No custodian witnessed the fall firsthand, and perhaps that is a mercy. To have seen Horus, beloved Horus, surrender himself to chaos would have been a wound from which no witness could recover. But I was on Terra when the word came, when the astropathic messages began to arrive, bearing news that made no sense, that could not be true, that shattered the certainties we had built our existence upon. The War Master had turned traitor. Fully half of the legions had followed him. The Great Crusade was over. The Horus heresy had begun. And the Imperium, that bright dream of unity and progress that had seemed so close to fulfillment, began its long fall into the darkness from which it has never emerged. 7 years. That is how long the heresy lasted, from Horus's corruption to his death at the Emperor's hand. 7 years to undo 2 centuries of triumph. 7 years to transform humanity's greatest achievement into humanity's most terrible wound. I have lived for 10 millennia since those years ended, and I tell you that not a single day has passed in which I have not thought of them. Not a single night in which their horrors have not visited me in dreams that feel more like memories than imagination. The war began with betrayal upon betrayal, each one more devastating than the last. Istvan III was where the mask first slipped. Horus, having secretly corrupted the commanders of 4 legions, his own sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters, ordered an assault upon a world whose population had rebelled against imperial rule. But the true targets were not the rebels. The true targets were the loyalists within his own forces, the Space Marines who would never have accepted the treachery their primarchs had embraced. They were sent to the surface. They were virus-bombed from orbit. 12 billion human inhabitants died in that attack, their flesh dissolved by engineered plagues that spared nothing organic. But they were merely collateral, acceptable losses in Horus's purge of those he could not trust to follow him into damnation. Some survived. Against all odds, against the mathematical certainty of their destruction, Space Marines of the betrayed legions endured the bombardment and fought back against brothers who had become enemies. They held for weeks, buying time with their lives, sending warnings that would take too long to arrive and be believed too late to matter. They died heroes, every one of them, and their names are remembered still in the halls of those chapters that descended from loyal bloodlines. But their sacrifice changed nothing. The heresy rolled on. Istvan Fikshiv was worse. The massacre there broke something in the Imperium that has never healed. Not merely military strength, but faith itself. The belief that brotherhood meant anything, that oaths could be trusted, that the warriors who fought beside you would not turn their bolters upon your back. 7 legions answered the call to bring Horus to justice. 7 legions descended upon the world where the traitors had gathered, righteous fury burning in hearts that still believed the universe made sense. The first wave struck hard. The Iron Hands, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, crashing against traitor positions with all the fury of those who have been betrayed by loved ones. They pushed forward, taking ground, believing that victory was possible, that the traitors could be crushed before their corruption spread further. Then the second wave landed. 4 legions, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, the Word Bearers, who had been counted among the loyal, who had been trusted to reinforce the assault, who revealed in that moment that they too had turned, that fully half of the Emperor's sons had chosen damnation over duty. The loyalists were caught between hammer and anvil, crushed by enemies before them and behind. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, was beheaded by Fulgrim, his own brother, a friend he had loved for decades. Vulcan of the Salamanders was captured and subjected to torments that would have killed any lesser, being 1,000 times over. Corax of the Raven Guard escaped with barely a handful of his legion intact, his force shattered beyond any hope of rapid reconstitution. I received the reports on terror. I stood in the War Council chambers and listened as astropaths wept blood, relaying messages of catastrophe that none of us could fully comprehend. I watched the Emperor's face as he learned of Ferrus Manus's death, the first of his sons to fall, the first proof that even Primarchs could die, that the demigods he had created were not immortal. I do not know what he felt in that moment. The Emperor's emotions were not things that lesser beings could read, his thoughts moving on levels that transcended human comprehension. But I saw his hand tighten upon the armrest of his throne. I saw something in his eyes that might have been grief, or might have been the cold recalculation of a general who has just lost a piece he cannot replace. The Crusade's dream of unity died in those hours. What replaced it was simpler, darker, more desperate. Survival. The galaxy burned. Across 1,000,000 worlds, brother fought brother in a civil war that made every previous conflict in human history seem trivial by comparison. Planets that had been compliant for decades erupted in violence as populations chose sides or had sides chosen for them. The infrastructure that had taken 2 centuries to build, the supply lines, the communication networks, the administrative apparatus of imperial governance, collapsed in months as the traitors systematically destroyed everything that might allow the loyalists to coordinate an effective response. And while the Imperium tore itself apart, Horus moved toward Terra. His advance was not a straight line, but a spiral, a tightening noose around the throne world that eliminated resistance and gathered strength with each world conquered. The traitor legions were not alone. They brought with them the demonic allies that their new patrons provided, creatures of the warp given flesh, horrors that had haunted humanity's nightmares since the species first developed the capacity for fear. Cults that had lurked in the shadows for centuries emerged to support the War Master's cause, their numbers far greater than any had suspected, their corruption far deeper than any had imagined. The loyalist Primarchs fought back with everything they had. Sanguinius led the defense of critical systems, his blood angels striking wherever the threat was greatest, buying time that could never be enough. Rogel Dawn fortified Terra itself, transforming the cradle of humanity into a fortress that could withstand any assault, a final redoubt where the Imperium would make its stand. The Lion, Guilliman, Russ, each one commanded forces that fought desperately to slow the traitor advance, to bleed Horus's armies, to give Terra the time it needed to prepare. It was not enough. It could never have been enough. I watched the preparations from within the Imperial Palace, saw the walls rise higher and the guns grow more numerous, saw the billions of soldiers who gathered to defend a world they knew they would likely die for. I walked the corridors where servitors labored without rest, where tech priests chanted binaries of fortification, where ordinary humans worked until they collapsed and were replaced by others who would work until they collapsed in turn. The entire population of Terra had become a workforce dedicated to a single purpose: survival. And beneath the palace, in chambers that only the custodians and the Emperor's most trusted servants could access, the Webway project continued. This was the secret that Horus's betrayal had interrupted, the great work that the Emperor had been forced to abandon in order to counter the threat his favorite son had become. The gate to the Webway was open, had been opened years before, a triumph of engineering and psychic manipulation that should have heralded humanity's liberation from the warp's dangers. But the wards that protected that gate required the Emperor's constant attention, his psychic might holding back the demons that pressed against the breach, hungry to pour through into the material realm. When Horus turned traitor, the Emperor faced an impossible choice. He could maintain the wards and trust his remaining sons to defeat the rebellion without him. Or he could join the war directly, abandoning the Webway project and everything it represented, sealing the gate forever and consigning humanity to eternal dependence on warp travel. He chose to stay. He chose the Webway. He trusted his sons to handle Horus while he completed the work that would save the species. It was, perhaps, the greatest miscalculation of his long existence. The war went badly without him. The loyalist Primarchs were mighty, but they were not their father. They made mistakes he would not have made, fell into traps he would have seen, lost battles he would have won. And with each defeat, Horus grew stronger, his forces swelling with reinforcements while the loyalists could only watch their numbers dwindle. The ruinous powers were feeding their champion well, the gods of chaos, those entities whose existence the imperial truth had denied, whose power the Emperor had spent millennia trying to circumvent, poured their blessings into Horus with a generosity that spoke of their desperation. They knew what was at stake. They knew that if the Emperor completed his Webway, their hold on humanity would be broken forever. Horus was their instrument, their investment, their last best hope of preventing a future in which they would starve. I learned later what the traitor legions experienced in those years, the gifts their new masters bestowed upon them. The Emperor's children became vessels for excess beyond mortal comprehension, their senses enhanced until pain and pleasure merged into a single overwhelming sensation. The Death Guard were blessed with plagues that made them immune to suffering, their rotting flesh a testament to the grandfather god who had claimed their souls. The World Eaters descended into rage so pure that it became indistinguishable from worship, their fury an offering to the blood god who drank deep of every skull they claimed. And the Thousand Sons, Magnus's tragic legion, were transformed in ways that defied description, their flesh becoming dust held together only by the sorcerous power that Tzeentch had granted them. They were no longer space marines. They were something else, something stronger, something more terrible, something that had traded its humanity for power that mortal limits could not contain. And they were coming for terror. I remember the day we learned that the outer defenses had fallen. I remember the silence in the War Council chamber, the weight of knowledge that needed no words to convey. I remember looking at my brothers, at the golden warriors who had served beside me since the unification, and seeing in their eyes the same understanding that filled my own. We would not survive this, not all of us, perhaps none of us, but we would fight, we would hold. We would make the traitors pay for every step they took toward the throne, and when the final accounting was made, the sons of the Emperor would know that the custodian guard had given everything in defense of their father. The siege of terror was about to begin, and I was there to face it. The sky burned for 55 days. I have tried, in the millennia since, to find words adequate to describe the siege of terror. I have composed accounts and discarded them, written testimonies and burned them, searched through every language I know for phrases that might convey what it felt like to stand upon the walls of the imperial palace and watch the end of everything approach. There are no such words. Human language evolved to describe human experiences, and what happened during those 55 days transcended anything humanity had experienced before. or has experienced since. The traitor fleet blotted out the stars. Thousands of vessels, warships, and transports, and things that had once been ships, but had been transformed by warp exposure into something organic and obscene, hung in the void above terror like a ceiling of malice. They bombarded the surface without pause, without mercy, without any strategic purpose beyond the infliction of terror. The void shields held, mostly, but the psychological weight of that constant assault, that unending rain of fire from a heaven that had become hell, broke minds that the actual fighting never touched. And then the landings began. They came down everywhere at once. Drop pods and gunships and demonic portals that tore reality open and vomited nightmares onto the soil of humanity's birth world. Millions of traitors, billions of cultists, entities without number that had never worn flesh until the warp gave them forms built from hatred and hunger. They crashed against the walls that Rogel Dawn had built, waves of corruption breaking upon ramparts of adamantine and faith. And for days the defenders held through exhaustion and terror and losses that would have routed any army in human history. I fought on those walls. I stood beside my brothers of the custodian guard, our guardian spears reaping traitors with every swing, our Auramite armor turning blows that would have killed lesser warriors. I saw things that I will never speak of, horrors that words would only diminish, acts of courage and desperation that deserve better monuments than my failing memory can provide. I killed until killing became mechanical, until my arms moved without conscious direction, until the golden armor I wore was so thick with blood and worse that its original color could no longer be seen. And still they came, and still we held, and still the siege ground on, consuming lives like fuel, burning through humanity's defenders, with a profligacy that only those who have already won can afford. The turning point came not on the walls, but within them. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, had tried to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery. In his arrogance, in his desperate need to prove himself useful, he had used sorcery to breach the wards around Terra and deliver his message directly. And in doing so, he had shattered the protections that kept the webway gate sealed. Demons poured through the breach, flooding into the tunnels beneath the palace, threatening to turn humanity's last refuge into a portal for infinite demonic invasion. The Emperor had no choice. He could not fight a war on two fronts, could not hold the webway and defend against Horus simultaneously. He sealed the gate, abandoning the project that had been his life's work, condemning humanity to eternal dependence on the warp he had tried to circumvent. And then he mounted the Golden Throne, that device which had been built to control the webway, and turned its power to a different purpose, holding the breach closed through sheer psychic might, preventing the demons from completing Magnus's unintentional treachery. He could not leave the throne. From that moment until this, 10,000 years later, the Emperor has not risen from his seat of torment, the defense of the palace, the fate of humanity, everything he had built and planned and sacrificed for. All of it now depended on sons. He could no longer directly command, on generals he could no longer guide, on an Imperium that would have to save itself or die. And Horus knew it. The War Master felt his father's withdrawal from the war, felt the sudden absence of the Emperor's influence on the flow of battle, and he pressed his advantage with everything he had. The walls began to fall, the defenders began to break, the mathematical certainties of attrition began to favor the attackers in ways that could not be reversed. Sanguinius held the Eternity Gate. I was not there for his final stand. I was fighting elsewhere, holding a breach that would have allowed traitors into the inner palace. killing and killing until my arms screamed for respite that I could not grant them. But I heard about it afterward, heard the stories from those who survived, heard the accounts that have since passed into legend and become something more than mere history. The angel stood alone before the gate to the throne room, the last barrier between Horus and the Emperor. His legion was shattered, his body broken by wounds that would have killed any mortal 100 times over, his wings torn and bloody and still somehow magnificent. And he faced not merely traitor space marines, but demons beyond counting. Horrors that the warp had vomited forth specifically to destroy him. Nightmares given form by gods who knew that Sanguinius was the last obstacle between their champion and their prize. He held. For hours that felt like eternities, he held. His sword reaped souls with every stroke, his presence inspiring defenders who had given up hope, his defiance a beacon that burned bright enough to be seen across the entire war zone. He knew he was going to die. He had seen it in visions, had known since before the heresy began that he would fall before Horus's hand. But he did not flee. He did not falter. He stood before the eternity gate and made the traitors pay for every inch in blood that they could not afford to spend. When Horus finally came for him, Sanguinius was already dying. But he faced his brother anyway, faced the thing that Horus had become, faced the avatar of 4 gods' worth of corrupted power, with nothing but a broken body and a will that refused to surrender. He lost. Of course he lost. No single being, not even a Primarch, could have defeated what Horus had become. But in losing, Sanguinius accomplished something that his victory could never have achieved. He created a crack in Horus's armor. Not physical armor. The breach was spiritual, emotional. A moment of hesitation born from the War Master's memory of the brother he had loved. The angel he had just destroyed. For one instant, one heartbeat, the thing that Horus had become remembered what Horus had been. And in that instant, Sanguinius's sacrifice bore fruit. The Emperor rose from the golden throne. I felt it when he moved. Every psyker on Terra felt it, a surge of power so vast that it eclipsed the sun, a presence so overwhelming that even the demons recoiled from it. He walked through the palace. He had not left in years, through corridors choked with the dead, through chambers that had become charnel houses. And with every step he took, the light grew stronger and the darkness fell back. He teleported to Horus's flagship, the vengeful spirit, that corrupted vessel that hung in orbit like a tumor in the void. He went to face his son, his favored child, his greatest failure. And he went knowing what I know now, what he must have known since the moment Horus turned, that only one of them would leave that ship alive. I did not witness what happened in the vengeful spirit's heart. No one did, save the 2 who fought there and the one who died. But the accounts that have been pieced together from psychic echoes and fragmentary evidence paint a picture of a confrontation that transcended physical combat. A battle fought on levels that mortal perception cannot reach. The Emperor did not want to kill his son. Even then, even after everything Horus had done, he held back, searching for some remnant of the child he had raised, some spark of the War Master he had trusted with everything, some possibility of redemption that would spare him the necessity of filicide. He fought defensively, absorbing blows that would have killed armies, speaking words that no one else will ever hear, trying until the very end to save what could not be saved. It nearly cost him everything. Horus's blow caught him when his guard was down, when he was reaching for a son who no longer existed. The wound was mortal, would have been mortal even for a being of the Emperor's power. A strike fueled by 4 gods' worth of hatred, aimed at the one soul in the galaxy they feared above all others. The emperor fell, his golden armor shattered, his divine flesh torn, his light flickering like a candle in a hurricane. And then a single custodian. Olanius Pius, some accounts say, though others name a terminator of the imperial fists or a nameless soldier of the imperial army, interposed himself between Horus and the fallen emperor. A mortal facing a god, a human challenging the champion of chaos. He died instantly, of course. He was unmade so thoroughly that not even atoms remained. But his sacrifice did what Sanguinius's sacrifice had done moments before. It reminded the emperor of what he was fighting for: humanity. Not the Imperium, not the Great Crusade, not the webway or the dream of transcendence. Humanity. The species that produced beings capable of standing before gods and refusing to yield. The children he had spent millennia trying to protect, trying to guide, trying to shepherd toward a future worthy of their potential. The emperor rose, and this time he did not hold back. What happened next was not a battle, it was an execution. The emperor gathered every fragment of his remaining power, every reserve he had held back, every scrap of psychic might he could muster, and he directed it all at the soul of Horus Lupercal. Not his body, his soul. The essence of the Primarch that the Chaos Gods had corrupted, the core of identity that they had twisted to their purposes. He burned it. He annihilated it so completely that not even the Chaos Gods could preserve it, could resurrect it, could ever again use the being called Horus as their instrument. The War Master's body survived for a moment longer, an empty shell that looked upon its father with eyes that held nothing behind them. And then it too crumbled into ash that the teleportation system scattered across the void. Horus was dead. The heresy was over. But so was everything else. The emperor was carried back to Terra by his surviving sons, his body broken beyond any possibility of conventional healing, his light fading with each passing moment. They brought him to the Golden Throne, that device which had once been meant to control the webway, and they interred him there, not to rule, not to guide, but simply to survive. His immense psychic power, the only force capable of holding his shattered form together. I was there when they sealed him in. I stood among my brothers as the tech priests connected the life support systems, as the machines began their work of preserving what could not truly live, but could not be allowed to die. I saw his eyes, those golden eyes that had once held the light of 1,000 suns, flicker one final time before the mechanisms closed around him. I do not know if he saw me. I do not know if he was still aware enough to recognize the faces of those who served him. I only know that in that moment, something ended that could never be restored. And something began that has defined every moment of the 10,000 years since. The Emperor of mankind was dead. Long live the Emperor. 10,000 years. I have watched the Imperium transform from what it was meant to be into what it has become. Watched the dream of reason and enlightenment curdle into a theocracy of blood and ignorance. Watched the institutions the Emperor created to liberate humanity become chains that bind it to an eternal present of war and suffering. I have seen the truth of his vision buried beneath layers of doctrine and dogma until even those who serve his memory no longer remember what he actually intended. I have stood vigil beside his rotting throne while the galaxy burns around us, while the enemies he sought to defeat grow stronger with each passing century, while everything he built slowly crumbles under the weight of its own contradictions. And still I serve. Still I remember. Still I carry the weight of witness that has become my only purpose. The scouring followed the heresy. 7 years of vengeance as the loyalist legions drove the traitors from the worlds they had corrupted, pushed them back across the galaxy, hounded them into the Eye of Terror, where the laws of reality no longer applied. The traitor Primarchs fled into that wound in space, those who had survived the war, and there they remain to this day. Demon princes now, twisted beyond recognition, immortal in their damnation. They raid, they scheme, they lead black crusades that pour forth from the eye like blood from an unhealed wound. But they do not conquer. Not yet. Not entirely. The Imperium that emerged from the scouring was not the Imperium the Emperor had envisioned. How could it be? The man who had held it together through force of vision and will was gone, interred upon a throne that was slowly killing him. His voice silenced, his guidance lost. Those who remained, the surviving Primarchs, the lords and generals and administrators who had served him, were forced to rebuild without blueprints, to govern without the governor, to maintain a dream they had never fully understood. Robout Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, did what he could. The Codex Astartes, his great work, broke the legions into smaller chapters, 1,000 warriors each, no more, ensuring that no single commander would ever again have the power to threaten the Imperium as Horus had threatened it. The structure was sound, the logic was impeccable, but it was also an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that the Brotherhood of the Legions could not be trusted, that the Emperor's own sons had proven themselves capable of treachery beyond imagination. We had become afraid of our own strength, and in that fear, we diminished ourselves. The High Lords of Terror rose to fill the vacuum of leadership, a council of the Imperium's most powerful institutions governing in the Emperor's name, while he sat silent upon his throne. The Administratum, the Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, the Adeptus Mechanicus, each one claiming authority, each one pursuing agendas that often conflicted with the others, each one certain that their interpretation of the Emperor's will was the correct one. The inefficiency was staggering, the corruption was inevitable. The slow ossification of what had been a dynamic, expanding civilization into a static, defensive empire was visible within centuries, irreversible within millennia. And the faith. Emperor, preserve us. The faith. The imperial truth died with the Emperor's ascension to the throne. How could it survive? The masses needed something to believe in, something to sustain them through the horrors of a galaxy that had revealed itself to be far darker than the rationalist philosophy had admitted. They looked upon the Emperor, the being who had conquered a galaxy, who had created demigods, who sat now in eternal torment, holding back the demons that sought humanity's extinction. And they saw a god. They worshipped him. They built cathedrals to his glory and burned heretics in his name. And no force in the Imperium could stop them, because to stop them would have been to destroy the only thing holding civilization together. Lorgar won in the end. The Primarch, who had been humiliated for his religiosity, who had turned to chaos because the Emperor rejected his devotion, who had orchestrated Horus's fall and set the heresy in motion. His vision of humanity, unified through faith, became the reality that his father's vision of humanity, unified through reason, could not achieve. The Imperial Creed is Lorgar's creation, even if his name has been struck from every record, even if the faithful who recite the litanies have no idea that they worship in the manner of the arch-traitor. I find this irony difficult to bear, but I bear it as I bear everything, because bearing is what remains to those of us who remember. The millennia passed. Threats rose and were defeated, or were not defeated, and became permanent features of a galaxy that seemed determined to destroy humanity through sheer variety of horrors. The orcs, those biological engines of war, infested every corner of the Imperium, an enemy that could never be fully eliminated because elimination was not in their nature. They grew back, always, no matter how thoroughly they were purged. The Eldari lurked in their craft worlds and their hidden dimensions, ancient and dying, but still dangerous, still manipulating events according to agendas that spanned centuries. The Tau emerged on the eastern fringe, a young species with the audacity to believe in progress, in unity, in a future that was not merely survival, but genuine improvement. Everything the Imperium had once believed, and had long since forgotten. And always, the forces of chaos pressed against the walls of reality, seeking entry, seeking souls, seeking the extinction of the species that had denied them their greatest prize. I cannot tell you of every war, every crusade, every desperate defense that has defined these 10,000 years. The numbers would mean nothing. Trillions dead, billions more consigned to lives of toil and suffering, worlds beyond counting, burned or corrupted, or simply lost to the endless attrition of a galaxy that has no mercy for weakness. What I can tell you is what it has felt like to watch, to witness, to remember while the Imperium slowly forgot everything except the necessity of endurance. It has felt like dying. A death that takes 10,000 years, a death that may take 10,000 more, a death that never quite completes itself because there is always one more battle to fight, one more enemy to face, one more reason to continue existing, even when existence has become indistinguishable from torment. The Emperor endures. This much I know with certainty, because I have stood in his presence, have felt the weight of his consciousness pressing against the walls of my mind, have witnessed moments when his will manifests in ways that cannot be explained by any mechanism of the throne. He is not dead as mortals understand death. He is not alive as mortals understand life. He is something else now, something that perhaps only he fully comprehends. A being of pure psychic force, holding together an Imperium that would collapse within days of his final passing. 1,000 souls a day, that is the tithe the throne demands. The price of the Emperor's continued existence. The cost of the Astronomicon that guides humanity's ships through the warp. 1,000 psychers, their life force drained to fuel the beacon that makes interstellar civilization possible. Their screams echoing through chambers that I have walked for 10 millennia. I have done the mathematics. 36 billion souls since the heresy ended, sacrificed to keep the Emperor alive, to keep the light burning, to keep the Imperium from fragmenting into a billion isolated worlds that would be devoured one by the enemies that press upon every border. Is it worth it? I asked myself this question in the early centuries, when the weight of what we had become first settled upon my shoulders. I ask it still in the quiet moments between duties, when I stand before the throne and feel the Emperor's presence like a pressure against my soul. The answer is that the question does not matter. Worth is a concept for those who have choices, for those who can weigh alternatives and select the best among them. The Imperium has no alternatives. The Emperor's survival is not a choice, but a necessity, the foundation upon which everything else depends. Without him, the Astronomicon goes dark. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium dissolves. Without the Imperium, humanity faces extinction. Not the quick extinction of a war lost, but the slow extinction of a species hunted to its final member by enemies who will never stop, never tire, never show mercy. We endure because the alternative is annihilation. We suffer because suffering is the price of survival. We have become everything the Emperor never wanted us to become, because becoming it was the only way to continue existing in a galaxy that punishes idealism with destruction. This is not the meaning I would have chosen. This is not the purpose I would have embraced in the days when the Great Crusade seemed destined to succeed, when the webway promised liberation, when the future was bright with possibilities that have long since turned to ash. But it is the meaning that remains, the only meaning that 10,000 years of witness has left me capable of perceiving. Humanity endures. Despite everything, despite the traitors and the demons and the Xenos hordes, despite the corruption and the inefficiency and the cruelty that has become institutionalized at every level of imperial governance, despite the faith that would have horrified the Emperor and the ignorance that would have broken his heart, humanity endures. We are bloodied and broken, diminished and degraded, a shadow of what we might have been if the heresy had never happened. But we are still here. We are still fighting. We are still, against all odds and all reason, alive. And now, in this late hour, something is changing. Guilliman has returned. The Primarch who wrote the Codex, who tried to rebuild the Imperium in the heresy's aftermath, who was struck down by a traitor's blade and lay in stasis for 10,000 years. He walks again. I have seen him. I have spoken with him. I have watched him look upon what the Imperium has become and seen in his eyes a grief that mirrors my own. He does not despair. This is what separates the Primarchs from lesser beings. They are capable of facing truths that would break mortal minds and continuing to function, continuing to fight, continuing to seek solutions even when solutions seem impossible. Guilliman has taken up the burden of governance that the High Lords proved unworthy to bear. He has launched a crusade to reclaim what has been lost, to push back the darkness that has been advancing for millennia. He has looked upon the rotting corpse of his father and refused to accept that this is how the story ends. I do not know if he will succeed. The odds against him are astronomical. The enemies he faces are legion. The Imperium he is trying to save may be too far gone to save. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy in half, a wound in reality that makes the Eye of Terror seem like a scratch, and through that wound pour horrors that dwarf anything we have faced before. But he is trying. After 10,000 years of slow decay, someone is finally trying to do more than simply survive. Perhaps that is meaning enough. I am one of the 10,000. I am custodian. I have witnessed the birth of the Imperium and its long dying, have carried the memory of the Emperor's vision through ages that forgot everything except the necessity of endurance. I have seen heroes become traitors and traitors become legends, have watched dreams curdle into nightmares, have counted the years in wars and the centuries in catastrophes. And I am still here, still watching, still remembering, still serving, because service is all that remains to those of us who have lived long enough to see the truth behind the myth. The Emperor protects, not as the faithful believe, not through divine intervention, not through miracles, not through the personal attention of a God who answers prayers. He protects through the sacrifice of those who serve him, through the suffering of those who fight in his name, through the blood and tears and endless toil of a species that refuses to die, even when death would be easier than continued existence. This is the history of the Imperium of Man, not a story of triumph, not a tale of glory, but a testament to endurance. The endurance of a species that has faced horrors beyond imagination and survived, diminished but unbroken, waiting for a dawn that may never come, but that we cannot stop believing in. 10,000 years of darkness, and still we wait for the light, and still we endure. And still, against all odds and all reason and all the forces of a hostile universe arrayed against us, we remain.